The father's justice. I saw my son, standing under the harsh midday sun, lifting heavy furniture like a day laborer in his father-in-law's company. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, the air thick and unmoving, the kind that sticks to your skin. His shirt was dark with sweat, clinging to his back, his name stitched across the chest as it belonged there, like that was all he was meant to be. I didn't call out to him right away. I just stood there for a second, watching, trying to understand how it had gotten to this point. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent most of my life learning to notice things other people ignore. Small changes, quiet patterns. The kind that don't make noise but mean everything if you know how to look. And what I was seeing in that moment wasn't just a job that didn't fit. It was something else. Something slower, heavier, like watching a person fade without anyone saying a word about it. Have you ever seen someone you care about start to disappear like that? Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but piece by piece. The way they speak, a little less. The way they stop pushing back. The way they accept things they never would have accepted before. It doesn't look like a crisis from the outside. It looks normal, until it doesn't. I had heard the stories, of course. Men who get pulled into their wife's family and somehow end up smaller than they were before. Decisions made around them, not with them. Jokes that land a little too hard. Laughter that lasts a little too long. And no one steps in. Not the family. Not the room. Sometimes, not even the person who promised to stand beside them. And that's the part people don't talk about enough. It's not just the work. It's not just the long hours or the wrong role. It's what happens when you're treated like you don't belong, and the one person who should notice doesn't say anything, doesn't correct it, doesn't even look uncomfortable. I watched Brandon set down another piece of furniture, slower this time, his shoulders tightening just slightly as he straightened up. He wiped his hands on his shirt, glanced toward the building, then back down at the ground. Not once did he look toward the office windows behind the glass, where the air conditioning hummed quietly and people with less experience made decisions about his day. And standing there, just out of sight, I found myself asking a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. How long had this been happening, and why hadn't anyone said a word? Before all of this, things looked steady from the outside. Brandon had always been that kind of man. Quiet, dependable, the one who shows up early and leaves late without needing to be asked. He wasn't loud about his achievements, but he carried himself with a kind of calm purpose that made people trust him. I had watched him build his life piece by piece. A degree, a solid job in logistics, a routine that made sense. Nothing flashy, but real and earned. Then he met Chloe Bennett. She was put together in a way that felt intentional, not overly warm, but not cold either. The first few times I met her, she smiled easily, asked the right questions, and laughed at the right moments. It felt normal. That's the word I kept coming back to. Their conversations were smooth, their plans practical. When they got married, I told myself he had found someone stable, someone who would meet him halfway. Her family was a different story, though it didn't show all at once. Raymond Bennett had a presence that filled a room before he said a word. Expensive watch, pressed shirts, the kind of confidence that comes from being used to control. He ran his business the same way, direct, decisive, not interested in being questioned. When he spoke, people adjusted around him without thinking. Donna, his wife, sat beside him most evenings with a polite smile, hands folded in her lap, nodding at the right moments. She didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, just existed, quietly, within his space. The first time I noticed something was off, we were at their dining table, late evening, soft light hanging over the center, plates half cleared. Brandon had just finished explaining something about inventory systems. Nothing complicated, just part of what he knew well. Raymond leaned back in his chair, tapped his glass lightly, and said, "That's good. Kid. But let's not get ahead of ourselves." The word hung there for a second. Kid. Casual, almost playful, but not quite. Brandon gave a small nod, the kind you give when you're not sure how to respond. He didn't push back. He didn't correct it. He just reached for his water and took a sip like it hadn't mattered. I shifted my eyes to Chloe, expecting something, even a glance, a reaction, anything that acknowledged what had just happened. She didn't look at him. She didn't say a word. She just adjusted her napkin slightly and kept listening to her father as if nothing had been said. That moment passed quickly. Conversation moved on. Plates were cleared, and someone mentioned dessert. But something about it stayed with me, not because of the word itself, but because of how easily it was accepted, and how no one in that room seemed to think it needed to be corrected. I didn't tell Brandon I was coming that day. I had learned a long time ago that if you want to understand what's really happening, you don't announce yourself first. The warehouse sat behind the main showroom, a wide metal building with loading docks stretching along the back. The afternoon sun hit the concrete hard, flattening everything into sharp lines and glare. Heat rose off the ground in slow waves, the kind that makes the air feel heavier than it should be. I parked off to the side and walked along the edge of the building, keeping close to the shadow where I could. There was a steady rhythm coming from the loading bay, the sound of wood scraping, something heavy being shifted, then a pause, then the same motion again. It wasn't office noise. It wasn't management work. It was physical, repetitive, the kind of work that leaves marks on your hands by the end of the day. And then I saw him. Brandon was standing near a pallet stacked with sectional pieces, one hand braced against the edge while he adjusted his grip. His shirt was soaked through, darker along the back and under the arms, the fabric clinging to him like it had been there all day. The name patch on his chest caught the light for a second as he turned, stitched in clean letters that felt too small for everything I knew he had done before this. He bent slightly, lifted one end of the furniture, shifted it forward, then straightened again with a slow exhale that carried farther than the rest of the noise. He had lost weight, not the kind that comes from effort or intention, but the kind that shows up when something isn't right. His face looked sharper, the lines more defined than I remembered. Even from a distance, there was a tension in the way he moved, controlled, careful, like he was pacing himself through something that didn't end when the shift was over. I stayed where I was for a moment, watching, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. 40 feet away, behind a row of glass panels, I could see the office area, clean desks, chairs pulled in neatly, the faint outline of someone moving past a window, cool air on the other side of that glass. Two separate worlds, separated by nothing more than a door and a decision. Brandon set down the piece he was carrying and rolled his shoulders once, slowly, like he was working something loose. He wiped his hands against his shirt without looking down, then reached for the next section. That's when he turned just enough to see me. For a split second, there was recognition. His eyes locked onto mine, and his body went still. I expected something simple, maybe a quick smile, maybe a nod, the kind of reaction you have when you run into someone you trust. But that's not what happened. His gaze dropped. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to break the connection before it could settle. He looked down at the ground, adjusted his grip on the furniture, and then looked back up again, this time with his expression already set, neutral, controlled, too controlled. He walked toward me, slower than he needed to, each step measured. When he stopped a few feet away, he didn't speak right away. His mouth pressed together slightly, like he was holding something back that didn't belong out here in the open. There was no relief in his face, no ease, just a quiet awareness of being seen in a place he hadn't intended for me to be. I stepped closer and put my hand lightly on his shoulder. The fabric was damp under my palm, warm from the heat. "How long?" I asked, keeping my voice low enough that it didn't carry beyond the two of us. He didn't look away this time, but he didn't hold eye contact either. "Since the first week," he said. 6 months. 6 months of this, and I hadn't known. He shifted his weight slightly, already turning back toward the pallet, as if the conversation had reached its natural end. Like there was nothing else to say. Like this was just how things were now. And standing there, with the sound of the loading bay filling the space again, I realized I wasn't just looking at a bad job. I was looking at something that had been allowed to happen every single day, without anyone stopping it, or even questioning it. and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still missing a piece of it. I was still standing there beside Brandon when I heard the door from the showroom open behind us, the soft click of it cutting through the steady noise of the loading bay. Footsteps followed, measured, unhurried, the kind of pace a man keeps when he knows he owns the ground he's walking on. I didn't need to turn right away to know who it was. Raymond Bennett stepped out into the sunlight, one hand adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as he crossed the concrete. His shirt was crisp, untouched by the heat, the fabric holding its shape in a way that felt almost deliberate against everything around us. He glanced once at Brandon, then settled his eyes on me with a small, controlled smile. "Stephen," he said, like we had planned to meet. "Didn't know you were coming by." "Thought I'd take a look," I replied, keeping my voice even. He nodded once, as if that confirmed something for him, then shifted his weight slightly, turning just enough to gesture toward the loading area without fully looking at it. "Good for him to be out here," he said. "Gotta start from the ground up. That's how you build someone properly." The words landed clean, simple, almost reasonable, if you didn't look too closely. He paused for a second, then added, "Wouldn't want him getting comfortable too early." Brandon didn't react. He bent down again, reached for another piece of furniture, and lifted it with both hands. The movement was smooth, practiced, like something he had repeated enough times that it no longer required thought. Raymond's gaze followed him briefly, then came back to me. His smile didn't change, but there was something behind it now, something quieter. "Besides," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more personal, "this is probably what he knows best." For a moment, nothing moved. The air felt still, heavier than before, like the heat had settled deeper into the space between us. I watched Brandon carry the piece inside without looking back, his steps steady, his shoulders set in that same controlled line. 40 feet away, the glass office reflected the sunlight, hiding whatever was happening inside. I looked back at Raymond. There are things men say without raising their voices, things that don't sound like insults unless you understand the intention behind them. This wasn't guidance. It wasn't development. It was placement, deliberate, measured, designed to keep someone exactly where he had decided they belonged. I nodded once, the same way I had nodded across conference tables for years when someone thought they were explaining something to me. "Of course," I said. "That makes sense." He seemed satisfied with that. The smile held for another second, then he turned slightly, already shifting his attention elsewhere, as if the conversation had reached its conclusion. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Because standing there, watching him walk back toward the showroom, I could feel something settle into place. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder, something quieter. The part of me that starts paying attention when a story doesn't match the numbers. And the more I thought about what he had just said, the more I realized this. It wasn't going to fix itself. I didn't go back inside. I didn't call out to Brandon again or try to continue the conversation. I walked to my car, closed the door, and sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, not moving, just letting the engine idle. The air inside was cooler, but it didn't change the weight of what I had just seen. After a minute, I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't needed in a while. Philip Moore. He picked up on the second ring. "Stephen," he said, his voice steady, like no time had passed. "Everything all right?" "I need you to pull something for me," I said. "Holt Home Furnishings, full picture, whatever you can get." There was a brief pause on the line, not hesitation, just calculation. "Give me a few days," he replied. I drove home without turning on the radio. The road stretched out in front of me, late afternoon light cutting across the windshield in long, narrow bands. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already stopped thinking about what Raymond had said, and started thinking about why. Philip called back 4 days later. I was in my kitchen when the phone rang, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. I answered, and he didn't waste time with small talk. "It's not what it looks like from the outside," he said. I didn't respond. I just listened. "They're carrying more debt than they should be," he continued. "Line of credit's been stretched. Payments delayed on at least 2 supplier accounts. Inventory numbers don't line up clean either. Too much tied up in stock that's not moving. I leaned against the counter, eyes fixed on the window above the sink. The light outside had started to fade, softening the edges of everything. Expansion too fast? I asked. Looks that way, Philip said. Opened more locations than they could support. Cash flow's tight. Tighter than they'd admit. One of the stores is already being quietly pushed for sublease. They're trying to keep it from showing. I let that settle for a moment. How bad? Another pause. Longer this time. If nothing changes, they don't hold. The words didn't come with urgency. Philip never worked that way. He laid things out clean, without emphasis. The same way I used to when I reviewed files that didn't add up. Numbers first, conclusions second. I set the cup down and moved to the table, pulling out a chair slowly. So the structure's weak, I said. Not just weak, he replied. Unstable. It's being held together, but not well. I looked down at the surface of the table, running my hand once across the wood grain without thinking. From the outside, Raymond Bennett carried himself like a man in full control, precise, confident, certain of every move he made. But behind that, the numbers told a different story. A quieter one. One that doesn't show up in conversation, or at dinner tables, or in the way someone dresses or speaks. It shows up in missed payments, in inventory that sits too long, in decisions that start to overlap when they shouldn't. Send me everything you've got, I said. I will, Philip answered. But Stephen, this isn't just mismanagement. This is the kind of pattern that builds over time. I understand, I replied. We ended the call without saying much else. I sat there for a while after, the room dimming around me as the light outside disappeared completely. The details were clear now. The structure, the strain, the gaps that had been covered just well enough to avoid attention. And the more I thought about it, the more one thing became impossible to ignore. Sometimes the people who look the strongest, the most certain, are the ones standing on something that's already starting to give way. And if that was true here, then the question wasn't whether the company had a problem. It was how long Raymond had known, and what he was willing to do to keep it from showing. I didn't rush anything after that call. I sat with the information first, let it settle into something I could use. The numbers weren't complicated once you stripped away the presentation. A business can look solid from the outside. Clean storefronts, steady traffic, confident leadership, but underneath, it all comes down to what's owed and who's owed it. And in this case, what was owed mattered more than anything Raymond was saying out loud. I made a few calls over the next week, quiet ones, the kind you make when you don't need attention, just access. One of the banks tied to Holt Home Furnishings had recently changed hands, and with that came a review of everything they had inherited. Accounts were being evaluated, some kept, some prepared to be moved off the books. It happens more often than people think. When a company starts to slip, its debt becomes something others are willing to let go of, sometimes at a price that reflects the risk. I arranged a meeting with a contact there. Nothing formal, just a conversation in a small office with blinds half drawn. Late afternoon light cutting across the desk in narrow strips. He walked me through the file slowly, page by page. Outstanding balances, delayed payments, notes from internal reviews that never make it outside those walls. By the time we were done, the picture was clear enough. I told him I was interested. The process itself wasn't complicated. It was paperwork, approvals, signatures that carried more weight than they looked like they should. I didn't need to understand every line to know what it meant. If you hold the debt, you hold the pressure point. You don't run the business day to day, but you decide how much room it has to breathe. A few days later, that part was done. But debt alone doesn't tell the full story. It gives you leverage, not presence. For that, you need a seat at the table, even if it's not the largest one. That's where Arthur Wells came in. I met him at a quiet restaurant just outside the city. Early afternoon, not many people around, the kind of place where conversations stay at the table they belong to. Arthur was older, carried himself with the slow patience of someone who had already made most of his decisions in life. He didn't waste time pretending things were better than they were. We talked about the business first, the way it had grown, the way it had stretched itself thin. He didn't defend it. He didn't dress it up. He just described it, plainly, the way people do when they're done trying to impress anyone. At some point, he looked at me and said, "You didn't come here just to talk." I shook my head. "No," I said, "I didn't." He nodded once, as if that confirmed what he already knew. "I've been thinking about stepping away," he said. "Been thinking about it for a while." "What would that look like for you?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, eyes drifting toward the window for a second before returning to me. "Clean," he said. "Simple. No dragging it out." We went over the details after that. Not in a rush, but without hesitation either. By the time we stood up from that table, the outline was in place. His share, 22%, would change hands. When it was finalized, I didn't feel any different. No sense of arrival, no shift in the room around me, just a quiet awareness of where things stood now. Debt on one side, equity on the other. It's a simple structure when you break it down. If someone owes you money, you have a say in what happens next. If you own part of something, your voice carries weight, even if it's not the loudest in the room. You don't need complicated terms to understand it. You just need to know where the lines connect and who controls which end. I sat in my office that evening, the last of the daylight fading through the blinds, casting long shadows across the desk. The documents were stacked neatly in front of me, each page signed, each detail accounted for. For the first time since that afternoon at the warehouse, I wasn't just observing anymore. I had a position, and the more I looked at what was now in front of me, the more one question started to take shape, not about what I could do, but about when I should decide to do it. I scheduled the meeting for a Thursday morning. A neutral conference room downtown, glass walls, a long table, nothing personal on either side. I arrived early, set my folder down, and took the chair facing the door. The blinds were half open, late light cutting across the table in thin lines. When Raymond Bennett walked in, he adjusted his cuff the same way he always did, small, practiced, as it belonged to him. He glanced at the room, then at me, and for a second I could see him measuring the distance between what he expected and what was actually in front of him. "Stephen," he said, pulling out his chair. "Raymond," I replied. We sat, no small talk, no easing into it. I opened the folder and turned it so the pages faced him. "I'll keep this simple," I said. "I've reviewed the numbers, line by line." I tapped the first page lightly. "Cash flow is tight. Supplier payments are delayed. Inventory isn't moving the way it should." I slid the page forward an inch. "You already know that." He didn't argue. He just looked down, then back up again. "I'm not here to take your company," I continued. "I'm here to stabilize it." I let the words sit for a moment, not pushing them, just placing them where they needed to be. "But that only works if a few things change, immediately." He leaned back slightly, hands resting on the table. "Go on." "First," I said, keeping my voice even, "Brandon moves into a director role, logistics and operations. Title, compensation, and authority that match his experience." I paused just long enough to make sure he understood there was no room to reinterpret it. "He stops working the warehouse floor." Raymond's expression shifted. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes. "Second," I added, sliding another page forward, "financial reporting becomes transparent. Quarterly reviews, independent oversight, no surprises." His fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion. "Third," I said, and this time I didn't look at the papers. I looked directly at him. "What happened in that loading bay stops." Completely. I let the silence stretch for a second. No more comments. No more positioning. No more treating him like he's there to prove something. The room stayed quiet. The air conditioning hummed softly above us, steady, indifferent. Raymond exhaled once through his nose, then folded his hands together. "This is about Brandon," he said, not as a question. I nodded. "This is about Brandon." He held my gaze for a moment, trying to read past what I had said. Maybe looking for something else behind it. I didn't give him anything to work with. No shift in tone, no hesitation. "This is how it moves forward," I said. He looked down again at the pages in front of him, not flipping them, just seeing them. Numbers, conditions, structure, all laid out in a way that didn't leave space for interpretation. The kind of clarity that doesn't need to raise its voice. Another pause. Then he leaned back, just slightly, and the confidence he had carried into the room didn't disappear. It changed shape. Smaller, more precise. "We'll need to review the details," he said carefully. "Of course," I replied. But the direction was already set. And as I watched him gather the pages, aligning them into a neat stack before sliding them back toward me, one thought stayed with me. Not whether he would agree, but how he would choose to respond once he understood that the room he was used to controlling no longer worked the same way. Brandon didn't come to me right away after the meeting. He took a few days, went back to the apartment, sat with things the way he always had. He told me later that it was a quiet evening when he finally brought it up. The kitchen light was on, nothing else in the room, a single bulb casting a soft circle over the table. Chloe was sitting across from him, her phone set off to the side, untouched. No raised voices, no sudden movements, just two people at the same table, finally saying what had been left unsaid for too long. He didn't accuse her. He didn't list everything that had happened. He asked one question, simple, direct. "Do you think what your father did was right?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked down for a second, then leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together loosely in front of her. The pause wasn't confusion. It was consideration. Brandon said he could see it in the way her eyes shifted slightly, not toward him, but somewhere else, like she was checking her answer against something that had already been decided. "He built everything from nothing," she said finally. Her voice stayed even, calm, almost rehearsed. "He knows how to run his business." Brandon waited. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He just stayed where he was, giving her the space to finish if she needed to. "And you trust that?" he asked. She nodded once. "I trust his judgment." That was it. No acknowledgement of what had happened. No space was made for how it felt. No shift toward him, not even a small one. The light above them didn't change. The room stayed exactly the same, but something in that moment settled into place in a way that couldn't be undone. Brandon told me he sat there for a while after that, his hands resting on the edge of the table, looking at the grain of the wood without really seeing it. There was no argument, no attempt to push further. He had already asked the question that mattered, and he had his answer. A man can carry a difficult job longer than he should. He can adapt to long hours, to being overlooked, even to being treated like he has something to prove every day he walks into a place. But there's a line, and it doesn't come from the work itself. It comes from the person who is supposed to stand beside him when things are no longer balanced. If that person steps back, even quietly, the rest doesn't hold. Brandon stood up from the table, walked to the sink, and ran the water for a few seconds without using it, just letting the sound fill the room. When he turned it off, he didn't look back at her right away. He dried his hands slowly, then reached for his keys. "I think I've known for a while," he said, not raising his voice, not forcing the words. "I just didn't want to say it out loud." He left the apartment that night, without closing the door too hard, without making it into something dramatic, just a clean exit, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. The paperwork came later, steady, methodical, handled the same way everything else had been handled up to that point. No rush, no hesitation, just a decision carried through. And as it moved forward, I found myself wondering, at what moment had the marriage actually ended? Was it that night at the table, or had it been ending quietly long before either of them chose to see it? It didn't change overnight. Brandon didn't wake up the next morning and suddenly become a different person. What I saw instead was something quieter. Small shifts, steady ones. He moved into the office space within a week, a desk near the back at first, nothing special. The chair was still stiff, the computer older than it should have been, but it was a start. The warehouse door stayed closed behind him. He began speaking more in meetings, not louder, just clearer. He would bring a folder, set it down, and walk through what he had found without rushing. Routes that didn't make sense, inventory that sat too long, adjustments that could be made without disrupting everything else. People listened. Not all at once, not immediately, but enough. 60 days later, the numbers reflected it. Fewer delays, better flow, the kind of improvement that doesn't draw attention until it starts to repeat. Raymond signed off on each change without adding commentary. No corrections, no side remarks, just a signature at the bottom of the page. Outside of work, things settled in a different way. Brandon found a small place a few miles from the main location. Nothing large, just enough space, a clean kitchen, a window that caught the morning light across the counter. I stopped by one afternoon. He was standing at the stove, stirring something slowly, the sound of it soft against the pan. He looked up, nodded once, then went back to what he was doing. No tension in his shoulders this time, no need to explain anything. That's how you know someone is finding their way back. Not through big moments, but through ordinary ones that start to feel steady again. I've spent most of my life working with numbers, measuring risk, weighing outcomes, deciding what holds and what doesn't. But some things don't fit into that kind of structure. Family, trust, the way people treat you when they don't think it matters. Those things don't show up on paper, but they carry weight all the same. Family is not supposed to be the place where you are reduced, where you're made smaller so someone else can feel larger. Silence might keep the room calm, but it doesn't make things right. It just delays the moment when the truth becomes unavoidable. And when it does, it always costs more than it should. And value, real value, isn't tied to a title or a position or where someone decides to place you. It shows up in how you're spoken to, how you're treated when there's nothing to gain from it. That doesn't change just because the setting does. If you've ever been in a place where you felt like Brandon did, where something wasn't right but no one said it out loud, right, I see you below. Sometimes being seen is where it starts. And if you believe that family should be the place that protects you, not the place that tests how much you can endure, then stay with this. Follow along. Because I keep thinking about that first moment, standing there, watching him under that sun, and I can't help but wonder, if you were in his position, how long would you have stayed before deciding it was time to walk away?